Boysen here.
Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With me today is one of our regular Viewmeisters, Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and he also moonlights as a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And we have a very special guest with us today. Don, you want to do the honors and introduce our special guest?
Sure, right. We're thrilled today to have with us Public Safety Chief David Boysen, who has been with for a long time. Mm-hmm. How many years?
27? Is that?
28, almost 28.
Almost 28 years, yeah. Mm-hmm. We're so glad to have him here today, especially when there's so much attention in the nation right now about issues of violence, particularly after what happened at Michigan State. So thank you so much for coming, Chief.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to put in a plug that David is also a graduate of Western Michigan University from the Criminal Justice Studies program, as we call it today. We changed the name a little bit ago.
Oh, okay, I didn't know
Criminal Justice Studies program. But
and you were my professor for a few of those classes, so
we were trying to, and neither one of us could remember exactly what those courses were,
right.
but probably advanced criminology.
I'm sure they were good, though, whatever they were.
At any rate, so it's interesting that we picked the topic of gun violence after our last program to focus on this month. And of course, as it turns out, we have a horrific incident of violence taking place right in our state this week, the horrific shooting at Michigan State University. And so that's sort of weighing on all of our minds, I know, as we talk about this topic today. I think it's very important, though, to make a distinction right off the bat between that kind of a mass shooting, and a mass shooting is usually defined as 4 or more people who are injured or killed in a single incidence of gun violence. And we've had, unfortunately, more than one a day this year, over 70 incidents already of mass shootings in the United States. So we need to talk about those kinds of incidents, but there's also just the, and I hate to use the term routine, I would put that in quotation marks, but the routine, everyday, common gun violence that afflicts so many of our communities, and of course it's also affected us here in Kalamazoo. And so I think that kind of interpersonal violence is different in kind from the mass shootings. I think one connection obviously is the easy availability of firearms, which is involved in both of them, but I think they require sort of different responses. I think you would probably agree with that, Chief. So I think probably a lot of what we're going to talk about to start with is to focus on that more common kind of interpersonal violence, the kind of violence that you more have to deal with on an everyday basis. Thank God you don't have too many mass shootings that you have to deal with in our community. Let's hope we don't have that. But of course your colleagues up in East Lansing, and I thought the police response was tremendous last week to the incident at Michigan State.
Yeah, and it was a very tough situation because there was a lot of calls coming in, a lot of reports of shots fired that were, I think when something like that happens, there was a lot of people hearing things like maybe someone slamming a door and we got another shots fired and different, so it was just a chaotic scene, and so under the circumstances, they really had their hands full, but they did a good job. And we look at those incidents too, right? So we've been talking to Western Michigan University. We're preparing for those things all the time, and see, we learn from other people. What did they do well? What could they have done better? Because it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but we got to use those situations to help us get better and help craft our response. Because it's, unfortunately, in our society, it's really not if, it's when something like that could happen in your community, and you got to be ready.
Yeah. And the coordination that's involved. I mean, the Michigan State University Police, that's a pretty large police department. That's a small city that you have there with 50,000 students and all the faculty and staff. But they immediately were given assistance from East Lansing Police and the Sheriff's Department and Michigan State Police.
And we even reached out to see if they need anything too. And but they said they had plenty of help, which, you don't want to flood them with too many resources. But that's where incident command is so important. And that's one thing we're really good at Kalamazoo Public Safety, because we're combining police, fire, and EMS. So the fire side has always been a little bit ahead of law enforcement when it comes to incident command. And so we've adopted that a long time ago. I think since 1982 we were combined police and fire. So the incident command is so important because you got a lot of resources coming in that you have to coordinate. And that's done through a really good and robust incident command model. So we practice that here. You know, we had something similar here. Luckily, it was a false report, but down in Portage, they had a report of a school shooting that we all responded to, and we co-responded with Portage and County and all of us. And unfortunately, that was a fake tip from someone out of the country that called that in.
Oh, really?
Yep. So, but you know, so you just got to be ready for those. But that is a whole different type of violence. We have to be ready for that. But there's different strategies we use to prevent different types of violence. One size doesn't fit all, and we can talk about some of those as we go forward here.
Sure. Another thing I would just try to throw out at the beginning here, and I think it'll fit in with what you want to talk about in terms of what you're doing locally, and that is that there's a lot of discussion about in responding to the common forms of interpersonal violence to adopt something called the public health model to try to focus on that. And the public health model basically argues for primary prevention, secondary prevention, and a tertiary or third level prevention. Primary prevention is to try to get at the larger social, structural, environmental factors or forces or causes of the disease or in this case, the violence. Secondary prevention is more of a focus on very specific at-risk groups. And that, I think, is what your department has been doing a lot of. And then the third level is once we have identified the person who's been afflicted with the disease, we need to treat them, right? Rehabilitate them or counsel them or treat them. And so there's that third level as well. So the primary, I mean, as a sociologist, I'm very concerned with the more historical social structures that lead to violence. Unfortunately, we very often don't talk about them that much or have a chance to really deal with them, trying to deal with structured economic inequality and institutional racism and you know, all the other kinds of issues there. We can come back and talk about that later perhaps. But I think what's probably more of interest is the forms of secondary prevention. And then I would also add that that sort of outside of the public health model but related to it is law enforcement, right? What's the criminal justice system? Because traditionally, if there's an incident of violence, you're going to get called, you're going to respond, you're going to react to that. But I think you're trying to do much more than just react. You're trying to also focus on the public health side and the prevention.
It's prevention,
so the tie-in between the two models, I think, is interesting. So let's talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Kalamazoo with regard to the issue of violence.
Sure.
See if anything I just said fits in with what you're up
well, a lot
to.
does, right? So a lot of those things you talked about with some of the more societal issues, those need to be addressed. But those are long-term fixes, and we have to, and you know, the quote we use is we have to stop the bleeding first, right? So if you have a patient come in, you triage your patient, and before you look at, you know, how they ended up in the hospital, you got to focus on, you know, if they have a wound, they're bleeding, you got to focus on stopping that bleeding.
Sure.
And that's what we're trying to do with our intervention strategy in Kalamazoo is we cannot thrive as a community if we have unacceptable levels of gun violence. And I'm talking about, you know, poverty, education, all these things that play into this. If you don't have control of your violence in your community, you can't fix these other issues you're talking about. So we got to stop the bleeding first. And that's what we really focus on is, and the thing is that we've learned is it's a very few number of individuals that are driving the majority of the violence, and we know who they are. So we have to focus on them, not just law enforcement, social services as well, because too often social services we're a broad approach, right? You're trying to serve the entire community. Yeah. We need to focus on a small number of individuals who are most at risk, and we know who they are. So not just our focus, but social services as well to, you know, and our message with some of these strategies, you know, we'll stop you if you make us, but we'll help you if you let us. And that's really the thing that we focus on. But there's different types of violence. So we have a group violence intervention strategy because when we started group violence intervention, over half of our shootings in the city of Kalamazoo were group involved. And we call them groups because you can call them gangs or whatever you want, but there's always some disagreement. Well, it's not really a gang, it's because they're not national affiliated and they don't have structured leadership, but they're a group of individuals that may associate with a particular area of town, call themselves a particular name, and that's a group. And so
co-offending networks is the jargon that criminologists use.
Yes, I'm a little rusty on some of those terms, but we know who they are. And in the past, we would look at a shooting incident as an isolated event. So, you know, we got someone shot, and we tried to solve that shooting, but we didn't look at the underlying group dynamics that led to that shooting and will lead to another shooting if we don't get ahead of those group dynamics. So that's something that group violence intervention, which is it's a community-led strategy. So Isaac brought that interface strategies for advocacy and action. The community brought that to our attention, like this David Kennedy model back in 2011. And we started implementing it in 2013, is trying to get the funding in place, and by 2016 we were fully implemented. So we've been doing it for a long time, and we've kind of tweaked the strategy to fit our community, but it's a partnership between law enforcement, social services, and Urban Alliance is our lead social service partner in that, and the community. We have community members, street outreach team, non-law enforcement officers that are working with us to try to do these intervention strategies, because we've learned that enforcement alone doesn't work. And outreach alone doesn't work, but when you combine those two and you balance those approaches, that's what has the most impact. And we're truly coordinated in our outreach and enforcement efforts. Our outreach team, we have some great individuals that work out of Urban Alliance that are, a lot of them were involved in gangs and groups in the past, criminal histories, but now they're willing to work with us, law enforcement, to try to get ahead of some of these things and calm this down. So it's direct communication with them, and we'll talk to them and say, hey, this particular person got shot. And before, if someone would get shot, like a non-fatal shooting, if someone was shot in the arm or leg, most often if you're group involved, you're not going to cooperate with the police. You're not going to tell us who shot you. And we would do that all the time. Hey, can you tell? Nope, I'm not talking to you. Sometimes it was not quite that nice, but they wouldn't want to talk to us. And so we wouldn't investigate a non-fatal shooting because there's no victim. So there's no one that's going to press charges. So there's no case, if you submit a case, it's going to go nowhere because there's no victim. So we would just close those cases out and walk away. Now looking back, what they're really telling us when we go to you, say, who shot you? And they're saying, I'm not talking to you. A lot of times they're telling us, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we walk away, what are we telling them?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. And so they would. And then the next non-fatal shooting would turn into a homicide. And so now we have a homicide where you have a victim that doesn't get to choose whether they want to press charges. It's a homicide. So we would have all hands on deck and commit all of our resources to solving a homicide, but we didn't do anything to break those chains of events that led up to that homicide. And that's where GVI comes in. So now if we have a non-fatal shooting, that same scenario, and I talk to you and you say, hey, who shot you? I'm not talking to you, go away. We'll come back with our outreach team, which is social services or street outreach workers and one of our community policing officers, and we'll talk to them and have a conversation that, hey, we're sorry you got shot. We're really worried that, we don't want you or your friends to retaliate for this shooting. You may not want to prosecute for your shooting. You might not want to say who it is, and we understand that, but we just need to know who it is, because we'll try to arrest them for something else. We'll try to catch them with a gun or something, because if they shot you, chances are they're going to go out and shoot somebody else, and we need to stop that. And so oftentimes we'll try to do that in front of family members and friends, and we'll leave, and many times we'll get a call from a family member and say, hey, he doesn't want to say, but so-and-so shot my cousin. And so that at least lets us know who's causing the violence, so we can put our enforcement efforts and focus on those shooters to get those people off the street for whatever it is, catch them with a gun or another charge, maybe they got warrants, but that calms it down. And the other piece of that that's, I think, really kind of impactful is we have what's called a custom notification letter. So let's say that we have someone that we believe is involved in shooting, but we don't have any case that we can prosecute. But we can't allow them to go out and we're going to wait for you to shoot someone so we can prosecute, but we know they're involved in that. So we'll give them what's called a custom notification letter. And we do that to victims too. We have a victim letter. And the letter just basically says is, we're aware of your criminal history. We don't want you to commit acts of violence in our community. I've already talked to, whether it's the prosecutor or the U.S. attorney who's a part of our team, to say, we've looked at your criminal history. If we were to catch you with a gun, this is what you can expect to get. Of course, we don't want you to take that route, and there's help if you need it, and we can talk about Urban Alliance and all the services there, but just kind of be forewarned, we're watching, and we give them that letter. And as what we found is those letters have a great way of calming situations down, because once they get that letter, it almost is a way out for them, an honorable exit, because if you get shot, a non-fatal shooting, and you don't retaliate, you look weak.
Yeah.
And then it brings on more violence, right? And so you can't look weak amongst your peers. But if we give them that letter, and it's not a fake letter, we will, if we catch you with a gun, we will charge you. And they can show that to their friends and say, hey, look, and police were just in my house, I got a letter from the chief, said if I get caught with a gun, I'm going to do a mandatory minimum of 5 years or whatever it is. it gives them an honorable exit so they don't have to retaliate. And we've seen that really does help. And so, again, GVI is about prevention. It's not about arrest. You know, if we have to make a lot of arrests, we're doing something wrong. It should be we should be reducing shootings without making a bunch of arrests.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that the people that you have working in GVI are very experienced, have the ability to relate to people who are involved in violence or proximate to it. And I think they really do an excellent job out there.
Yeah, we're very lucky. And again, these relationships with these folks have been 10 years plus building with some of these individuals, because it was really risky too. You think about that for them. You know, they got a criminal background. They've been arrested multiple times. And amongst their peer group, you're not supposed to be friends with the police. You're not supposed to talk to them. You're not supposed to be seen in public with them. And then also, conversely, on our side, back in 10 years ago when I started doing this, people within my department look at me and like, why are you hanging out with this guy's a convicted felon? We're going to catch him dealing drugs again, and we'll say we told you so. And so, kind of started with Michael Wilder, who's our GVI coordinator. He's just a great guy. And Michael was, and he'll tell you, he's a 7-time convicted drug dealer. And grew up in that lifestyle, and now he's about my age now. So, but he was the first to come across and said, if I'll help you keep guys out of prison. I'm not going to work with you if it's about putting guys in prison. I'm not going to do that. I'm not your guy. But if you want me to help you keep guys out of prison, I'll help you with that. And he kind of was the first one to come across and really had the courage to be seen with someone like me in public. And we built a team around him, and it's getting bigger every year. And we got more and more officers that are really buying into this strategy and making it work. So it's really kind of a unique thing in Kalamazoo that we have such strong partnerships with community members that can engage with these folks. Because on social services, another thing, these people are kind of disconnected from society. They don't want to get services. They don't want to ask for help. A lot of times they're embarrassed, or they don't even know where to start. So they don't. A lot of them never had a job. They're like 30 years old, never had a job. But what we found is, if they get a relationship with that outreach worker first, and they start building trust, then they can get plugged into services, because they're not going to go direct to services, but someone they trust can say, hey, talk to so-and-so at Urban Alliance, a really good person, or whether it be employment, or they have jobs lined up. And Michael Wilder says it great. He's like, I'm going to get you a job, okay, and you're going to get fired. But I'm going to get you another job, and you're going to get fired again. I'm going to get you a third job, and that one might work. But he stays with them, though. And that's really, we're seeing people really turn their lives around through that.
Yeah, and then Momentum works there to try to help people that have been long-term unemployed get some skills, particularly social skills, that enable them to get back in there. And that's what we're working out of Urban Alliance.
Yep, and Change of Status is the other program at Urban Alliance that we feed these folks into. It's a similar program to Momentum.
So this model, called the David Kennedy model, who's the criminologist who kind of came up with some of these strategies. And so I think in the literature they talk about focused deterrence. Now that's the part where you're responding and you're threatening. If we catch you with a gun again, we are going to arrest you. You will be prosecuted. You will serve some prison time. So there's an effort to deter through the threat of future punishment.
Yep.
But that's not what you do alone. It's got to be combined with
balanced.
This other focus, the sort of the public health side, and the other buzzword from criminology, collective efficacy, which is just the notion that there are people out there who care for you and are looking out for you and want to try to make things better for you. That's where these other guys, like Michael, come into play. And there's also the grandma effect, I think, in terms of collective efficacy, right? The grandma effect. If you get the grandmas involved, right?
You got to get the family involved.
Get the family involved, get the other community members who care about these people and don't want to see them get shot, don't want to see them go away to prison. But they tell them, you've got to straighten up. You've got to listen to what, you've got to follow that letter. You've got to do what Michael's telling you to do here. So it's that combination of the deterrence, the threat of some kind of law enforcement
but it has to be,
combined.
And it has to be swift, certain, and legitimate. It can't be hollow threats, right? We don't hand out a lot of those letters. I think we have about 15 to 20 letters a year out. So when we give a letter, it has weight behind it, because if we didn't follow through with that, then it would be meaningless. So part of the problem with criminal justice when it was too broad of an approach is we didn't have swift, certain, legitimate consequences for committing crimes. You could commit the same crime 10, 15 times and get a slap on the wrist, and then the 20th time you got such a big criminal history, you get hammered with a big sentence. That's not a legitimate way to do policing. This is very legitimate because we're telling you up front, if you get, and we've done this. I've got a perfect story and point. We had at one point a 19-year-old young man that was involved. Almost every week he's either getting shot at or shooting at somebody. Almost every week.
Wow.
Just out of control. This was about 2 years ago. And so he got arrested on a charge, a warrant or something like that, and he went to the county jail. So me and another officer went to the county jail and we served him a custom notification letter. But before we did that, I talked to the U.S. Attorney and said, hey, this individual is really tearing up this community. If we were to catch him with a gun, would you take him federal? Because he'd been in and out of local jail. The U.S. Attorney said, well, and the U.S. Attorney is part of our GVI strategy. He said, well, he's only 19 and he really doesn't have that much of a criminal history. Most of it's juvenile, but because he's doing this and we're part of this GVI strategy, we will take him federal if you catch him with a gun. So we went to the jail, we gave him this letter, and I said, hey, I talked to the U.S. Attorney. I'm just letting you know up front, if you get out and you pick up a gun and we catch you with a gun, we will prosecute you through the feds. You will go federal. And it was a really great custom because he said, well, but you can help me get a job. And like, yeah, I need it. He's like, I need a job. You can help me with that? Yep, we'll help you get a job. So we're really encouraged after that. Thought, hey, he's gonna seek help and try to turn his life around. Well, within 2 days of getting out of jail, he drove by a house on the east side, shot up the house. Officer stopped the car, located the gun, arrested him. And I called the U.S. Attorney and they held their word and they took him federal. And so he did about 3 years in federal prison only because he was so young. But still, that's a pretty significant time. But it got him off the street for a while. And it was great because the federal judge played the video. We had, because he was in the jail, it was recorded when we gave him that letter. And the federal judge played that at his sentencing. And he says, you mean to tell me those officers told you that if they caught you with a gun, you were going to go to federal prison, and you didn't listen and you picked up a gun within a couple days of getting out of jail? And so to me, that's a legitimate way of doing law enforcement because we told him up front. He chose not to listen.
Yeah.
He's got no one to blame but himself. Now, in the old days, especially when it came to some of the other things we did with like drugs and things like that, is, like I said, you get caught with drugs and you go to jail, and you get caught with drugs, go to jail, and then you got a huge criminal history, 3 prior deliveries, and then we get you with like 50 grams of crack, and we're going to put you in federal prison for 10 years. Never saw it coming. That's not a legitimate way to do law enforcement. So we've kind of learned from our past mistakes in law enforcement, and we're being very, very strategic on who we, take off the street and who we give a second chance to. And that's where we really work hard with our outreach team, because sometimes they'll tell us, hey, they'll say, Chief, this guy, he's going to kill someone. You guys got to do something about him. They're not going to help set him up, or they're not going to do anything, but they just tell me, hey, you guys got to get this guy off the street. He's going to kill someone. And another quick story is we had a really tragic incident just before the new year here, where we had a 16-year-old young man shot and killed. He was a group-involved individual. He'd been in and out of juvenile, and we can talk about our juvenile justice system. We got some issues there, but he'd been in and out of juvenile custody, but he got killed. And we knew another youth did it. I think he was 17 years old that shot him. 16 years old. So he was shot by a 16-year-old. One of our outreach workers contacted me and said, Chief, you looking for so-and-so? I said, yep, we are. He says, well, I can get him to turn himself in, but only to you. So he's, so that outreach work, I said, you can get him here? He said, yeah, I'll have him at headquarters in half an hour. So this outreach work had a relationship with this young man that just killed someone, talked him into turning himself into us. So he brought him to headquarters, turned himself in, and he gave a full confession. That outreach worker knew that if he didn't get arrested, someone was going to kill him out there. So that outreach worker knew I need to get him in custody, because number one is I don't want anything to happen to him and get shot and killed, and when I could have done something about it. And two is knowing that the kid is wanted for murder, and I don't. It's dangerous for our officers to go after someone that's desperate like that, and that could have turned out bad if we got to try to take this murder suspect into custody. You never know what could happen. So he avoided all that by bringing him in headquarters and turning him into us. And I think that shows, how effective that strategy can be, because you got to build trust.
Absolutely. Yep. Wow. Gee whiz. And when these guys get involved with the federal prison, they go far away, don't they? They don't go away around here.
Right. Yeah. And we tell them that too, is like, you can get shipped all across the country, you never know. So it makes it obviously harder for your family to come visit you and all those things. But those, we have the U.S. Attorney on board. Mark Totten is our new U.S. Attorney here, and we work very closely with him. And he understands that, you know, it's not about numbers. It's not about how many people we put in prison. We just got to be very selective and only use those resources when they're absolutely needed for the right people. And that's what we do through our GVI interventions, because we know who they are. We know who's driving the violence. A lot of times these guys think that we don't know what they're doing out there. We know, and it's not if, it's when we catch up with you, but hopefully we can do some interventions before you do something that lands you in prison. Wow. Yeah.
The violence tends to be very concentrated, right? There's certain high-risk places and certain groups of high-risk individuals that, and you know who they are, and you know how to focus on them. So this strategy can work because of that. It's not just a wide-scale across the city problem. You know that there are certain hot spots right there where this is more likely to happen, and so you need to concentrate your resources in responding to those situations, right?
Yeah, and I think when people think of gun violence, they think it's just huge problem. That, oh my, how are we going to, it's such a big problem, we'll never get a handle on it. Well, I look at it a little differently. I look at, it's not as big as you think it is. So if you look at over half of our shootings are group involved. So a little over 50%, you know, it was closer to 60 to 70%. Now we're running closer to around 50% of our shootings are group involved. If you look at the number of people that associate with these groups at any given time in the city of Kalamazoo, you're only talking about maybe 200 some individuals associate with these groups. And then if you really narrow that down further, most of those people in those groups aren't shooters, okay? There's a few that are, and so you take that funnel from 200, you know, the whole city population from 75,000 to 200, and now you narrow that down to who are your shooters, and you may have half a dozen, okay? Those are what we focus on. And because those half a dozen can drive that retaliatory violence back and forth. So again, we know who they are, we know what groups, and it's really the key.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done to help the groups. I'm thinking the partnership with Judge Bell and the juveniles that were involved. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that we had to really start focusing on since 2020. Is prior to 2020, we didn't have a lot of shootings involving our youth. When I say youth, under age 18 in the state of Michigan. Since 2020, and especially in the last year, we've had a huge problem with 14, 15, 16-year-olds shooting each other, getting guns and shooting. And so it's been a huge challenge because we don't have as many levers to pull with juveniles. But one of the things we need to do really is focus on prevention and for juveniles. Before they're 14, 15, 16, we identify those kids that are look like they you know, if you have police contacts prior to age 14, whether you're a suspect or a victim, that's a problem, right? Because, you know, either one is traumatic, whether you're a victim of a crime or a suspect, especially at a young age. So we look at those and we try to engage those into youth programs. So one of the things we started in 2016 is our bridging opportunities, where we identify these kids, and those were 14, 15, and 16-year-olds, and we get them involved in work experiences. Boys and Girls Club is our partner in that. So we have 6 kids now that are year-round in this, and we're going to get a new cohort in March. But those 6 kids work out of the Boys and Girls Club. It's court order, it's probation, but they go to there and work. They get programming, they get work experience, education, tutoring. But the key to that is the kids actually get paid as staff at the Boys and Girls Club. And so you see these kids really grow and blossom because, you know, I think too often people get, you know, kids especially get labeled as a bad kid. And, you know, and then so, you know, if you label them as a bad kid, you treat them like a bad kid, they'll act like a bad kid, right? But now we bring them in this Boys and Girls Club and we treat them with a lot of respect. They give them a staff shirt, so they got their, you know, staff and they got their credentials. And you can really see the pride they take in that because someone believes in them and they're getting a paycheck and working. And it's just been a great program, and it's a great partnership with Boys and Girls Club. We're really, really happy to be part of that. And then we have other strategies too with our Police Athletic League. So we're really looking this year, that's one of my main focuses, is on getting the right kids in those events. You know, those kids that are at risk that might not know about these things, get them in those events because we got a lot of different events and they're free, but keep those kids engaged in something positive.
Yeah, we put a lot of money into summer programs last summer, an extra $2 million. But we were skeptical. We got an extra 4,000 kids involved, but are we getting the right kids?
Right.
That's the challenge. Are we getting these kids who usually wouldn't be involved in stuff in these activities? And that's a challenge. It is.
So we met with Johnny Berry, who's at Parks and Rec, and he's doing a great job overseeing the Police Athletic League. We are this spring going to identify those kids that we talk about with 4 or more police contacts. And we're going to go door to door to their houses, talk to their parents, give them the information, when the sign up is, what the activities are available, what they might be interested in, and try to get those kids engaged in that. Because I think a lot of the right kids aren't getting there because they just don't know about it, or they're not pushed to do them. And I think that direct communication with those kids, and Johnny's willing to go door to door with us and do that, so we're looking forward to that. Yep.
That's great.
So one of the other issues here is just the easy availability of guns, right? And with regard to either mass shootings or the kind of common interpersonal violence that we're talking about here, the availability of a weapon is one of the biggest factors. I mean, you know, many years ago, some of the disputes that are happening would be resolved with a bloody nose, not
Right.
with a homicide, right? So where are the guns coming from? How can we stop the flow of guns? And what kind of things are you guys able to focus on to deal with that particular dimension of this problem?
Yeah, well, that is a big problem because it used to be when I was, you know, I've been here almost 28 years, and if you got a gun off the street, it was a big deal. You rarely got guns. Now we're seizing on average about 2 a day. On average, when I say seizing, they're illegal guns. Guns are illegal for people to possess, about 2 a day. We really don't have problems with legal gun owners committing crimes. These are all people with guns that should not have them in the first place. You know, they've got prior felony conviction, they don't, you know, or they're underage, they just shouldn't be possessing those guns. But as what we found, I think, is what's really driven gun violence since 2020 is, and I talked to a lot of people that see the same thing, but in 2020, you know, we had COVID, we had civil unrest, we had all these things going on. And for whatever reason, everybody wanted to go out and buy a firearm. And you see the sales of handguns went through the roof, and there was just a lot of people buying guns. Well, is what the problem with legal gun owners is many of them will not be very responsible in how they, you know, store those weapons. They'll leave them in their car, you know, under the seat in the center glove box, or just leave them unsecured. And so what our kids are doing is a lot of youth are going out there, and that's why they're breaking into cars, they're looking for guns, and unfortunately too often they're finding them. So that's how a lot of these kids are getting guns. And then we also have a big problem with straw purchasers, which is, you know, you have someone that is legal to buy a firearm, they'll go to the gun store with someone who's not legal, and they'll buy the gun and walk out the door and just hand it to them. And so we're seeing a lot of that too. But there's just and then for whatever reason, I think that especially with our youth, I think we're in a gun culture now. I equate it this way. When I was a kid, it was cars, right? You always want to have the nicest car and the coolest car, nice wheels, all this stuff. Now kids don't care so much about cars. They want to have the coolest gun. They want to have extended magazines. They want to have drum magazines. They want to have laser sights. And it's you know, so somehow we got to a really big gun culture with these kids. And you're right. A lot of things that would have ended up in a fight before, now it's going to be a shootout because there's guns everywhere. And so, and then also the criminal justice system, you know, we used to have teeth in the gun laws where, you know, if you were a convicted felon, you got caught with a gun, you could be facing mandatory 2 years in prison, and everyone knew that. So you might have guns stashed around, but if you were a felon, you wouldn't risk carrying one because you didn't want to get a mandatory minimum 2 years. Well, we got away from that, and those don't get charged very often, and I think people know there's just not the consequences for carrying, because we'll arrest someone with a gun and charge them with carrying a concealed weapon and felon in possession of a firearm, and they'll be, you know, right back out. And so that word gets out too, and they know that. And that's, I think COVID led a lot of that with, because we couldn't arrest people, they couldn't lodge people, courts were behind, and so I think we're still seeing that.
So after the Michigan State shooting earlier this week, there's been a lot of talk about doing something in the state legislature. There are, I think, a trio of bills that had already been introduced that are going to be pushed. And again, I don't think anybody would say these are the final solution, but they're baby steps that we can begin to take, perhaps. So focusing more on background checks and red flag laws and stronger safe storage laws. So what do you think about those kinds of laws? What about, in particular, the red flag laws that, you know, could we have identified this, could we have gotten this guy who committed the murders up in Michigan State with a red flag kind of law? Could we have,
Right.
done something there? Is that a feasible kind of solution from your perspective?
Well, see, I think we missed the point a lot when it comes to why are we having this gun violence. Is it the guns or is it the people with the guns? Because I think one of the things that is a huge problem in this country and a huge fail is our mental health. We have people walking the streets now that have severe mental health issues. And what's being done to address that? Too often, law enforcement is the only ones to deal with it, because we're called if someone's having a mental health crisis. They call the police. It's not a crime to have a mental health crisis, but we have to protect the individual from themselves, and we may have to take them into protective custody. But those people, yes, if there's red flag laws, they should not get guns. But what are we doing to help all these people with severe mental illness? And another factor I'm going to throw on that, because I think that's also missed, is we are in this country, we are flooded with methamphetamine now, more than I have ever seen. So I started my career as a drug cop. And so when I was a drug cop 20 years ago, an ounce of meth would be about $2,000, up to $2,000 an ounce. Now it's about $190 an ounce. Wow. Because we were flooded with this meth coming across the border that is not the same meth as what it used to be. And what we're seeing is it's causing severe psychological damage to the people that use it. And once you get hooked on it, it's super addictive. And once you get hooked on it, you have long-term brain damage from it, and you basically are disconnected from society. And so you have, that's why homelessness, I think, is really going up around the country, is because these individuals, a lot of them that we deal with, have a substance abuse problem, and then that feeds into their mental health. I don't know which came first, the chicken or egg, the mental health or the substance abuse, but they're interrelated. And so we have all these things going on in our society with a huge influx of guns, and that's why you're seeing a lot of these, we've had some pretty horrific incidents in the last couple of years in Kalamazoo County, and almost all those, involved individuals who are on meth. When I'm talking about shooting at officers, we had sadly a tragic case of a county deputy got killed by a subject, and that's the common denominator of some of these incidents we're seeing, is they're just really delusional and have a meth problem. And so those are all just layers to this problem of gun violence that we're dealing with in this country. And but we need more help with treatment. We need more help with mental health. All these things really we got to get a hold of that, because the guns we can't get rid of the guns because there's so many out there. But we have to focus on what is driving those individuals to have such, to walk onto a campus at a university and just randomly shoot people. Like what led up to that? What could have been caught before that happened? Because there had to be red flags out there with this individual. What resources did he get or not? And let's figure out why this is happening. We just had a awful incident in Kalamazoo at the transportation center. Just delusional person just started randomly shooting people at the transportation center, and shot at officers, and it was a tragic incident all the way around. Officers had to use deadly force to protect everyone in that transportation center. Thank goodness that no citizens got seriously injured. We had some that were wounded, but I mean, that's just, these things happen in Kalamazoo, and it's becoming more and more frequent in our society, and it's really really troubling.
So meth, they used to make their own meth. Now they can buy it.
Yeah.
No trouble.
Yep. So you hardly see meth made locally anymore because it's so readily available and cheap to get now. So it's, and like I said, it's just affecting people different than what you used to, and we're really seeing that with some really severe psychosis with these individuals that we're dealing with.
Wow. Gee.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is that you always say social supports reduce crime, the lack of social supports increase crime. So why are they using the meth? Why do they have to do that? I mean, what's going on? I mean, we're missing something in the society right now. And it's, if you have, okay, I was at a meeting the other day at the foundation where they have that subgroup working on violence, and this particular one was on youth. And this one person who is working in the public schools and has a prominent position said some kids came to him and they say, look, I got to get out of here because in my neighborhood, we got these groups, gangs, whatever you want to call them. And he says, I'm not into violence, but some of them are. And these other groups, because I'm associated with them, They're after me
Sure.
as well as
Yeah.
these guys, but I have to live there. So if we don't deal with that whole thing about what's going on in that community and create alternatives for
Right.
these kids, all of them are in trouble.
And that's where we're blessed in Kalamazoo that we have so many good people working on this stuff. We have so many organizations. One of the things we have really come a long way in is focusing and getting these people to work together and getting these groups to work together. And we at Kalamazoo Public Safety have been kind of the, we'll convene everywhere. We'll get everyone in, and whether it's on the homeless side or our group violence, and we bring all these people that provide these services together. Number one, our officers know who to call to refer things to, and number two is, if you think about it, if you're a social service provider, you might not know who's beefing with who and who's doing, but we do, and we tell them so they can focus on the right people. And so we have that information on who's driving the violence, and we can focus their resources on that. So it's a really good partnership.
And I think KidNet has helped a
Yep.
lot with that. KidNet has really brought together the different youth organizations in the city and kind of coordinated who's doing what and where we can go. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So we got a lot of good, you know, thanks to the city commission, you guys given us a lot of resources, with especially with the youth and engagement and things like that. Because we got to get ahead of this with our next generation. You know, really got to focus on those kids, and that's why those activities through KidNet and PAL and all these things are going to be really good going forward for the community.
Maybe we can transition to another but related topic, and there's some specific tie-ins here that I want to maybe raise with you. But of course, we all know about the most recent incident in Memphis, the beating death of Tyree Nichols at the hands of the Memphis police, and those officers have been charged, as we know, in that case. But again, this has been a persistent problem that we've faced in our society over the years, and I'm wondering, you know, so the question is, how do we prevent this form of police violence? How do we prevent police brutality? So there's certainly a number of things that have been suggested over the years, and I just thought I would maybe throw a couple things out to you to think about. So one of the things that I think probably needs to be addressed right off the bat is the racial divide in the country. I mean, there's really strong research, just an article recently in a criminology journal about the racial divide in fear of the police. And so often, African American citizens don't see the police as there to help them or support them or protect and serve them. White citizens do. But black citizens generally do not, because of all kinds of historical issues and problems. And so how do we deal with that racial divide? And then, of course, in the Memphis case, the officers who engaged in the beating were African American themselves, which some suggest maybe reflects a broader issue with police culture, right, or subcultures within policing itself. So there's a number of really tough, difficult issues to kind of crack there. But what do you guys see in terms of the racial divide? I know there's been issues in the past here in the city of Kalamazoo as well. Certainly there are many African American citizens that didn't trust the department, didn't trust policing in Kalamazoo. So how do you see that? How do you assess where we're at with that now? How has the department been trying to respond to this problem?
Yeah.
An easy question.
Yeah, boy. Yeah, we get this solved right now, right? So one of the things about policing is, you know, we're kind of, I don't want to say a unique profession, but if something bad happens in policing across the country, it gets shared, and we all watch it on nightly news, and everybody sees it, and it gets, you know, on social media, and unfortunately, people just see the uniform. So, you know, it could be another department that had, you know, because, you know, there could be departments out there like Memphis, sounds like they got a cultural problem in their department. But people think, well, if they do, all departments do it. And that's, you know, and so we're, you know, I'm up against, as a chief, you know, I'm trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing and we're treating people with dignity and respect. But I'm also knowing that people don't look at us as just Kalamazoo Public. We're just a police officer, just like those guys in Minneapolis or you know, Memphis or wherever. And that's kind of disheartening, because we work so hard in Kalamazoo to build those relationships and trust. And we just talked about some of these non-traditional things we're doing to help create those partnerships, especially within the African American community, because they're by far most disproportionately represented in gun violence. So that's who we're working with to try to save those folks that are most at risk for this behavior, and we're developing true partnerships with that. And it's really disheartening when a lot of that trust and legitimacy that we work so hard to build gets taken away because something happens across the country. And we really learned, I learned a lot from the Minneapolis incident that, you know, I just thought, well, that's not here. You know, and now I know, hey, if something happens across the country, it's going to have a local impact.
Yeah.
Our own community is like, what are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen here? And so that's why when the Memphis thing happened, I got a statement out right away to our community to say, you know, this is what Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety is doing to make sure that doesn't happen here. And this is, you know, an awful event and just, you know, completely appalling to us to see as well. And then we also got a joint statement with the other chiefs and sheriffs later that week to also express that we're all on the same page. So we know now that something happens across the country has got a local impact. So, and to that end, I had a meeting with, got a lot of community people together to talk about some of the things, these issues in policing and what we are doing at Kalamazoo Public Safety to make sure that that doesn't happen here. And really, again, I think, unfortunately, everyone, you know, it's easy to look at the negatives in our society and whatever you're talking about. But if you're looking at policing, how far we've come, and the fact that everything we do is going to be recorded, right? We got body cams, we got in-car cams, and not only that, but everybody's got a phone, they're going to film you. So if an officer does something wrong, it's going to be captured on video somewhere, and we're going to see it. And but we do, you know, we do look at that. And back to culture, that's one thing that really I'll give, starting under Chief Hadley, a lot of credit for, is really changing the way we do policing. We used to be driven about arrests, making arrests and tickets, and we'd stop 10 cars, and eventually you're going to get one with a gun. That's what we did. That kind of that shotgun approach to policing. And that really damaged those relationships with the urban community. I mean, because you think about it, just because you live in a high crime neighborhood doesn't mean you should get stopped by the police every time you drive home and get, you know, stopped and asked if you can I search your car. That's the kind of policing we were doing before, and it was wrong, and we realized that. And so back in 2013, we really started pushing a lot of changes in the way we do policing because too many people were getting caught up in that type of policing. And that's where, you know, some departments have not necessarily changed the way, you know, have come along as far as we have, and that's why you see some cities have a lot of tension between their communities and the departments, especially communities of color, and their departments, because they maybe have continued with that type of policing instead of that really focused approach that we do, that focused deterrence and with the balance between outreach and enforcement. But unfortunately, we all get painted with the same brush in this profession because we know that just having that badge has that, you know, the historical piece that comes with it, all the bad things that have happened in the past, you know, is projected the minute we have contact. But we found that is what breaks that down is when people get to know the officers as people, not just the badge. When our officers are getting out of the car, getting to know folks in the community, they get to know them. So they don't look at they don't look at me as just another person in a blue uniform. They know me as Dave Boysen, and we have a relationship. And that's really what we have to do, what we focus on in Kalamazoo and really in law enforcement across the country. That's really what we have to do, because we can't be just that warrior mindset. We are there to serve and protect the community. And many times those people in those urban communities, we're all they have to call. They need us in those. They just didn't need the type of policing they were getting. They need policing, just not that type. And so we've worked hard to change that. But again, I think law enforcement will get there. I think these events that happen are painful and they're tragic and they hurt, but it's turning chiefs around the country saying, hey, we got to do it better. We can't keep doing policing the old way. We have to work in partnership with the community, not against the community.
Yeah, it's really important for people to know that policing in our country is so decentralized, right? Really sort of fragmented, you might even say, right? So you got federal level, state, and then of course most of the policing takes place at the local level. We have 10 different police units in Kalamazoo County alone, or something like that.
Yeah.
And so again, it's a very decentralized system. And so yeah, if we're looking at policing, it's easy to make blanket statements about the police in general, but in reality you have so many different organizations, and you could have very different cultures, as you point out, from one city to another in terms of how policing is carried out. So I think that's really important to accept and acknowledge. There's the larger history, of course, of institutional racism and how it's affected policing historically in the United States. And so, again, it's easy for people to make the more blanket statements, but I do think it's important for each department. And so I think it's, you're to be commended that they're making efforts within our own local police, public safety organization to make those kind of changes. Now, some of the things, you mentioned body cameras. What about things like body cameras? What about citizen review boards? What about the kind of training, in particular with regard to de-escalation of situations? So what about those kinds of things? What of those things are we doing locally? What do you think about those things with other departments across the country?
Well, you have to do those things. I mean, so de-escalation training, we do crisis intervention training. Most of our officers are crisis intervention trained. So that's like a 40-hour training, in-service training that they go through to really learn those de-escalation techniques, how to talk to people, how to, calm the situation down. And, the thing is, when an incident goes bad in law enforcement, that's all everyone talks about. But every day across this country, there's an incident where an officer could have been legally justified in using deadly force but choose not to. Officers do not want to use deadly force. That's the last thing we want to do because we know how, everything that carries with the weight that carries. So many times, we're really focused on that alternative ways that we can deal with a situation, and we train in that very hard, and we bake that into a lot of our training scenarios and how to de-escalate and really that verbal communication. One of the things I'll talk about with training is, that is a concern around the country is really just because of some of these high-profile incidents in policing, people don't want to do this job anymore. And we have a huge problem with recruiting and hiring. We're down about 30 officers in the city of Kalamazoo. We have 30 openings. And we'll hire 4 and then we'll lose 5 through either retirement or someone leaves early. And so, but we're not unique to that. It's really across the country. And I think a lot of in the old days, say when I started, your families would encourage you to be a police officer, great career. And now families are saying, I don't want you doing that. Not my son, not my daughter. I don't want them doing that, or not my spouse. And so we're having a hard time getting the people. And I worry about across the country that we're not going to have the quality officers that we have now. Who's going to do these jobs? And if you look at what happened in Memphis, I think that in that unit they were all pretty inexperienced newer officers, and there wasn't a lot of supervision. And that concerns me is, we're going to have less and less experienced officers out there, and are more mistakes going to be made because we don't have the caliber officer we had a few years ago. And that's what worries me, because that's going to impact all of us. So we work really hard to get the right people in the door. Even though we're short, we're not just going to hire people to fill the spots. We're going to make sure we get the right people, and we'll go short because we know one bad hire, what that can do to this profession. So
right. I was just reading about Norway, where they require that people have 3 years of college education, and one of those years is about studying society and critical thinking. And we're having trouble to just get people to apply. So it's tough.
yes, it is.
All right, we've got just a couple minutes left, Don. You got a last question for the chief? Put him on the spot?
Yeah.
All right.
He's doing fine. Could you just say a little bit about your relationship with community mental health in Kalamazoo?
Yeah, so we're working very closely with Integrated Services Kalamazoo on several fronts. One is through our community service team, which we work with. It's our homeless outreach team. So we work really closely with them. And then also with our youth diversion program too, we're working closely with ISK on that. I'm really excited that they got that new facility that's hopefully going to be open in the fall, because that's really a big gap in our community. We'll have people in mental health, and there's not a lot of places we can take them if they're having a crisis and we have to get someone committed. We could either take them to Borders or Bronson, but usually they're kind of in and out. There's just not a lot of emergency services for these people in crisis. So ISK is going to be a great resource for us when they get that building up and running.
So that's a place on Kalamazoo Avenue, and that's going to be open 24 hours, I believe, too. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's
a big need.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Going to the hospitals and the emergency room is not the answer.
No,
at
it
all.
is not. Nope. Oh. And they're under resourced and overwhelmed with the work.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
so.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. How are we doing on time here, John? Okay.
A couple minutes.
Well, thanks, Dave, for being here.
Yeah.
Really, really good to have you, and I'm really encouraged by hearing about the good things that are going on at Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety. Just want to let people know that, again, we have a fabulous technical crew that helps us put this program on. Daniel Smith and Larry Mahana, John Pravancher, and I want to mention John in particular because he just celebrated a landmark birthday. So John had his 90th birthday the other day, and he's in here helping us, our great floor director. So thank you, John, and happy birthday to you. And another member of our crew is Bob Kildare. Bob suffered a terrible accident recently and has been in the hospital, and just most recently has been moved to Mary Free Bed.
I heard that.
And so if people are who know Bob, really fantastic guy, member of Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, in addition to being on our tech crew here, just a super guy. If anybody would like to send a message up to Bob at Mary Free Bed, I think he would be happy to hear from folks. And we're trying to, KNOW is trying to work to help ensure that Bob's wife is taken care of. She has some health issues as well, and so we want to make sure we're coordinating. So if anybody wants to help out in that effort, there are a lot of different things that are needs that are there. We would be happy. You can contact Daniel Smith or myself at Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, and we're trying to put together an effort to help Bob and his wife. So just wanted to report on that. Thanks again to our fabulous tech crew, and okay. So thanks again, David, for being here. Thanks for all that you do. Yeah. I hope that in some small way the education you got in the criminal justice program at Western has helped you along in your career.
Yeah.
Always glad to hear that. Don, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And we invite you to come back and join us again the next time on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.